Chapter 1. Lock the arena doors. The Alpha King's voice didn't boom like thunder. It didn't carry the raw, vibrating fury of a typical predator. It was a dead, conversational whisper that somehow cut through the ambient noise and reached the ears of 3,000 werewolves. "If the slave dies," Zarek added, leaning lazily over the marble balcony, "nobody leaves this stadium alive." 5 minutes earlier, Vaelia tasted copper and wet dirt. The silver whip had flayed the back of her shirt into ruined, bloody ribbons, but she refused to stay down. Her breath came in ragged, painful hitches. She dragged her knees under her muscles shaking violently as she forced herself upright. Morwenna, the Regent Luna, adjusted the immaculate, lace-trimmed sleeves of her white gown. She stood 10 feet away, safely behind the executioner, looking at Vaelia like one looks at a crushed insect on an expensive rug. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" Morwenna sighed, inspecting her own manicured nails. "I ordered you to scrub the Grand Hall. You tried to break into the restricted archives. You stole from the crown, little rat." "I was looking for a map," Vaelia rasped, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the gravel. "Because your hospitality is getting incredibly boring." A guard stepped forward, raising the whip again, but Morwenna held up a hand. "Toss her into the feeding pit," Morwenna ordered, stifling a yawn. "I'm tired of looking at her. Let the strays have her." 2 heavy-set guards grabbed Vaelia by the arms. She didn't thrash. She didn't scream. She went completely limp, turning herself into dead weight, so they had to drag her across the sharp gravel. "I'll try to choke the biggest hound on my way down," Vaelia said, her voice raspy but perfectly steady, looking back at the Luna with chilling, hollow apathy. "Give you a real show for your money." Morwenna's fake smile completely vanished. "Throw her in." "Now." The guards shoved Vaelia hard between the shoulder blades. She tumbled down the steep, jagged stone ramp, hitting the muddy floor of the fighting basin with a sickening thud. The rusted iron grate slammed shut above her. Deep in the shadows of the pit, 3 feral hounds began to growl. They were massive, starved creatures, and the scent of her fresh blood instantly triggered their predatory instincts. Vaelia pushed herself up onto her elbows. She didn't have a weapon. She picked up a handful of thick, wet mud. Then, the growling abruptly stopped. The hounds didn't just quiet down. They whimpered. Their ears flattened flush against their skulls as they pressed their bellies flat into the mud. They actively crawled backward into the darkness, violently trying to get away from the center of the arena. They smelled him before the crowd did. The air pressure in the stadium dropped so fast it popped Vaelia's ears. The suffocating scent of dark pine and ozone flooded the basin, thick enough to choke on. Morwenna turned toward the royal balcony. The color instantly drained from her pristine face. Alpha King Zarek didn't make a grand, theatrical entrance. He just appeared at the railing, staring down into the mud. He wore no crown, no royal cape, just a dark, unbuttoned shirt. His posture was rigid. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles twitched under his skin. Thump, thump, Zarek's chest hitched. His inner wolf didn't just wake up. It slammed violently against his ribs, confused, frantic, and completely rabid. The scent of the bleeding girl hit his nose, and it felt like a physical glitch in his brain. It wasn't the typical, sweet pull of a mate. It was addictive, raw honey layered over something ancient, rotting, and terrifyingly cold. It didn't make him think mine. It made his wolf pace in circles and think, "What the hell is that?" His fangs violently punched through his gums. He gripped the marble railing, his claws involuntarily extending and digging deep into the stone, cracking the expensive architecture. "A discipline issue, my king." Morwenna spoke up quickly, her voice a pitch too high as she tried to salvage the heavy silence. She defied pack law. She tried to steal. Zarek didn't look at his stepmother. His glowing golden eyes remained locked entirely on the girl sitting in the mud. He studied the way she breathed, the way she didn't cower. "You're bleeding on my dirt," Zarek said. His voice was completely devoid of empathy. Vaelia tilted her head back. She didn't look away from the glowing gold of his eyes. She met the gaze of the most lethal predator in the kingdom without a shred of self-preservation. "Then get me a towel," Vaelia fired back. A collective, terrified gasp rippled through the 3,000 pack members in the stands. No one spoke to the tyrant king like that. People had lost their heads for looking at him wrong. Zarek's breath caught. A dark, jagged smirk broke across his stoic face. He didn't want to protect her like some white knight. He wanted to pry her open. He wanted to see what kind of broken, impossible audacity was hiding underneath that fragile human ribcage. "Execute her!" Morwenna snapped at the guards, realizing she was rapidly losing control of the room. "Shoot her from the grates." "No," Zarek interrupted. He didn't raise his voice, but the single word stripped all authority from the Luna. He flicked his hand toward the prison warden standing by the levers. "Open the main gate. Let the crawler out." Morwenna's eyes widened in genuine, unscripted shock. "Zarek, no! She's a human slave. She's completely unarmed. The crawler is a mutated beast. That's not an execution. That's a senseless slaughter." Zarek finally turned his head to look at Morwenna. His eyes were utterly dead. "Then she better find a sharp rock," Zarek said coldly, looking back down at Vaelia. "Open it." The warden slammed the lever forward. The heavy steel gears of the main arena gate screeched. Vaelia stood alone in the center of the basin. The ground vibrated beneath her boots. A massive, misshapen beast with heavily armored scales, blind white eyes, and dripping, acidic jaws dragged itself out of the darkness of the tunnels. Up on the balcony, Zarek leaned forward, his knuckles turning bone-white against the railing. "Show me," his wolf demanded, a sick fascination warring with an urge to jump down there. "Show me what you are." The crawler shrieked, launching its massive body forward to tear the fragile girl in half. Vaelia didn't run. She didn't brace for impact or look for a weapon. She let out a slow, exhausted breath, and completely surrendered to the unnatural coldness lurking in her veins. As the beast descended, the brown in Vaelia's eyes vanished, swallowed by a terrifying, pitch-black void. The light around her physical body didn't just dim. It violently bent backward. The ambient noise of the terrified crowd, the howling wind, the shrieking beast, all of it was instantly muted. It was completely eaten by the shadows that began to silently rise from the mud beneath her boots. Chapter 2. The beast lunged. Vaelia didn't brace for impact. She dropped. Her knees hit the mud a fraction of a second before the creature's jaws snapped empty air where her head had just been. Vaelia slid under its massive body, her fingers wrapping around a jagged, rusted iron spike abandoned in the dirt. She didn't hesitate. She drove it upward, burying it deep into the soft, unarmored flesh of the beast's throat. The creature choked. Dark blood spilled into the dirt. It crashed into the mud and went completely still. Vaelia stood up. She wiped a smear of blood from her cheek. The terrifying black void in her eyes had vanished, replaced by her normal brown. She didn't look at the dead monster. She looked straight up at the royal balcony. Up there. Zarek didn't speak. He didn't blink. His inner beast slammed against his ribs, roaring in dark approval. She didn't just survive. She executed. "Archers!" Morwenna's voice shattered the silence. The Regent Luna leaned over the balcony, her face twisted in absolute fury. "Shoot her!" She used a weapon. It invalidates the trial. A dozen guards raised their silver-tipped crossbows, aiming directly at Vaelia in the pit. "Stand down." Zarek's voice wasn't a yell. It was a low, guttural vibration that made the weapons shake in the guards' hands. Morwenna whipped around to face him. "Zarek! The law states no weapons in the blood arena. She cheated." Zarek finally turned his glowing golden eyes to Morwenna. The sheer killing intent, radiating from his gaze, made her take a sudden step back. "She used a piece of scrap metal, abandoned in your filthy pit, Morwenna," Zarek said, his tone lethally calm. "That is not cheating. That is survival." He stepped closer, forcing the Regent Luna to crane her neck to look at him. The trial by combat is over. She won. Lower the crossbows, or I will personally rip the arms off anyone who pulls a trigger. No one moved. The guards instantly lowered their weapons, staring at the floor. Zarek looked back down at the mud, his eyes locking with Vaelia's defiant gaze once more. He turned to his elite commander. Bring her to my quarters. Now. By the time the heavy oak door of the king's chambers slammed shut, she was sealed inside. The lock clicked from the outside. Vaelia didn't rush the door immediately. She stood in the center of the massive, dimly lit room, taking in the suffocating luxury. Obsidian walls, heavy fur rugs. It smelled violently of dark pine and ozone. The side door opened, and Phaedra, the pack doctor, slipped in carrying a leather satchel. She was a strange, eccentric woman, with messy hair and an unsettling smirk. Sit, Phaedra ordered, pointing to a wooden chair. Before you bleed on the king's rugs. He hates that. I'm not sitting, Vaelia snapped, her muscles still coiled tight. Why am I here? Because you did the impossible, little wolf, Phaedra said, pulling a glowing red jar from her bag. You made the tyrant blink. Now sit, or I'll sedate you. Vaelia hesitated, but the exhaustion was catching up. She sank into the chair, wincing as Phaedra unceremoniously ripped the ruined fabric of her shirt to expose the wounds on her back. This will sting, Phaedra warned. She smeared the glowing red salve over Vaelia's bruises. It was freezing cold at first, but then a strange, sweet sensation began to seep into her pores. There's a side effect to this medicine, Phaedra casually mentioned as she packed her bag. It stimulates the blood, accelerates healing. But it also artificially raises your core temperature. What does that mean? Vaelia asked, her skin already prickling. It means you're going to feel very, very warm soon, Phaedra whispered with a wink. Try not to do anything I wouldn't do. Before Vaelia could process the warning, Phaedra slipped out the door. The heavy lock clicked again. Hey! Vaelia hit her fists against the wood. Open this! Come back! Silence. She leaned against the door, her breathing growing ragged. Fire raced through Vaelia's veins. Her vision blurred. Her skin burned like she had swallowed hot coals. She clawed at the collar of the oversized clean shirt Phaedra had left her, gasping for air. The room spun violently. Having trouble breathing, slave? Vaelia whipped her head around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Zarek stepped out of the shadows of the balcony. He had shed his royal coat, wearing only a black shirt rolled up to his elbows. The suffocating scent of dark pine and ozone hit her again, but this time, it made her knees weak. What did she do to me? Vaelia gasped, stumbling backward until her spine hit the cool stone wall. A heat-inducing compound, Zarek said coldly, though his jaw was locked dangerously tight. Phaedra thinks she is playing matchmaker. Then let me out. Zarek scoffed, taking a slow step toward her. I didn't lock the door. She jammed the mechanism from the outside. Break it down, Vaelia demanded, her voice shaking as another wave of unnatural heat rolled through her. I don't take orders from a slave, and I don't submit to tyrants. Vaelia tried to push past him, but her legs finally gave out. She collapsed. Before her knees could hit the floor, Zarek moved. He was a blur. His massive hands caught her waist, hauling her up. The moment his skin touched hers, a brutal shockwave ripped through both of them. Vaelia gasped, her nails instinctively digging into his shoulders. Zarek flinched, his golden eyes flashing wild. She was burning up. Her scent ash and dark honey crashed into his senses, completely shattering his self-control. His fangs forcibly lengthened, scraping his bottom lip. Get your hands off me, Vaelia gritted out, pushing weakly against his chest. Zarek didn't let go. Instead, he forced her backward, pinning her firmly against the stone wall. Not to hurt her, but to trap her in place. The size difference was overwhelming. He completely caged her. "Stop moving," he growled, his voice a lethal vibration against her chest. "I said let me go. If I let you go, your heart will explode from the heat," Zarek snapped, his face descending until he was mere inches from hers. "Stop fighting me for one damn second." He slid his bare hands up her neck, cupping her face. Ice. Pure, freezing alpha energy radiated from his palms, sinking into her burning skin. Vaelia let out a shuddering breath, her body instinctively leaning into his touch despite her hatred for him. Her eyes fluttered shut as the brutal heat began to recede. Replaced by his numbing cold, she slowly opened her eyes. He was staring directly at her lips. His chest rose and fell rapidly. This was wrong. Everything about her was wrong. But his wolf was already choosing for him, completely tearing through his logic. The tyrant king was losing his mind. He wanted to mark her, to make sure no one else ever could. "Don't look at me with those eyes, slave," Zarek whispered hoarsely, his thumb tracing her jawline against his own will. "I do not have the mercy you expect." Vaelia swallowed hard, refusing to look away or show fear. "I never expected mercy from a monster." Zarek's grip tightened on her jaw. A dark, broken sound escaped his throat. "Good." He leaned in. The air between them vanished. Crash. The heavy oak door splintered inward, the jammed lock shattering. Zarek spun around, pulling Vaelia behind his massive frame in a millisecond, his eyes glowing a deadly gold. Garrick, the prison warden, stood in the ruins of the doorway. He was bleeding heavily from a cut on his forehead, his chest heaving. "My king," Garrick panted, his eyes wide with panic. He stepped aside. On the floor behind him lay a small, fragile body. Nissa. All sound vanished from Vaelia's mind. The world went completely dead silent. She froze for a fraction of a second, her breath caught painfully in her throat, before she pushed past Zarek's massive frame and dropped to her knees. Nissa was convulsing. Her veins were turning a sickening black, and white foam bubbled past the little girl's lips. Vaelia's trembling hands reached out, gently cupping her sister's freezing face. "Nissa? Nissa, look at me. Sister." Nissa choked out, her eyes rolling back. Chapter 3. Phaedra didn't wait for an order. She shoved past the broken door, dropping a heavy leather medical kit onto the stone floor. "Nightshade extract," Phaedra cursed, pulling a silver vial from her bag. "It's moving fast." She tipped Nissa's chin back and forced the thick, glowing liquid past the little girl's foaming lips. Vaelia held her breath. Her fingers tightly gripped her sister's freezing hand. The sickening black veins on Nissa's neck stopped spreading. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to recede beneath the skin. Nissa's chest shuddered, pulling in a real, steady breath. Vaelia exhaled a broken sob, burying her face into Nissa's shoulder. Zarek stood completely still in the center of the ruined doorway. His jaw was locked tight enough to shatter bone. He looked at the shattered wood, then down at the slave holding her sister as if she were the only tether keeping her in this world. "Why?" Vaelia didn't look up, but her voice was raw, laced with a venomous hatred. "She is a child. Why would Morwenna do this? Because you survived the pit." Zarek's voice was devoid of emotion, a sharp contrast to the chaos tearing through his chest. Vaelia carefully laid Nissa's head against the rug and stood up. She turned to face him, her brown eyes completely bloodshot. "Keep her safe. You're the king. Do something." Zarek stepped closer. The shadows of the room seemed to bend toward him. "I can pull rank on Morwenna for pack warriors. I cannot interfere with her slaves. By law, your sister belongs to her." Vaelia's jaw tightened. "Buy her. Take my life instead. I don't care. Just save her." "My protection has a price," Zarek stated coldly. It was a cruel manipulation. He knew it. But his inner beast was clawing at his ribs. demanding he secure this girl. He needed a legal loophole. He needed her bound to his authority. Anything. Vaelia didn't even blink. The Alpha tournament begins at sunrise. Zarek's golden eyes narrowed, pinning her in place. You will enter. You will fight. Garrick, still bleeding by the door, took a step forward. My king. She's human. The pack warriors will tear her in half. It's a death sentence. Zarek silenced the warden with a lethal glare before looking back at Vaelia. Win the tournament, and you earn pack citizenship. As a citizen, you can claim your sister as family. Until then, I will keep Nissa under guard in the medical wing. He stepped fully into her space, his towering frame forcing her to tilt her head back. If you lose, you die. And your sister loses my protection. Do we have a deal? Vaelia didn't flinch. She looked right past the monster, staring directly into the eyes of the man making the deal. I'll win. The morning sun over the obsidian training yard offered absolutely no warmth. You hold that blade like a dead branch. Vaelia swung the heavy wooden practice sword. Garrick blocked it effortlessly, swept his leg, and knocked her feet out from under her. She hit the packed dirt hard, coughing up a cloud of dust. Get up, Garrick yelled, circling her. Morwenna's assassins won't wait for you to catch your breath. Vaelia scrambled up. Her muscles screamed from the residual effects of Phaedra's heat compound and the sheer physical trauma of the pit. But she lunged again. Garrick sidestepped. He moved right behind her, grabbing her waist with both of his broad, calloused hands to forcefully correct her stance. Your hips are too high. Lower your center of gravity, or they'll snap your spine in the first round. High above the yard, solid stone turned to dust. Zarek crushed the marble railing of the royal balcony under his fingers. The sight of the warden's hands gripping her waist sent a blinding, violent surge of possessiveness through his veins. The logic in his brain shut down entirely. A low, guttural growl ripped from his throat. Mine. He didn't take the stairs. He vaulted over the balcony. He landed in the center of the training yard with a concussive impact that sent a shockwave of dust into the air. Garrick instantly dropped his hands from Vaelia. The warden swallowed hard. His eyes darted nervously from the glowing king to the slave, before he backed away quickly into the shadows. Zarek stalked forward. The air pressure in the yard dropped so fast it made the guards on the perimeter grasp their ears. His eyes weren't human. They were a terrifying, glowing gold. Step away from her, Garrick. Zarek's voice was a vibrating, lethal threat. Zarek walked right into Vaelia's space. He snatched a wooden training blade from the weapon rack. Attack me, Zarek ordered. Vaelia wiped a streak of sweat from her forehead. You're an alpha. I said attack me. Vaelia swung with everything she had. Zarek didn't even blink. He parried the blow, the sheer force of his block vibrating up her arms and making her teeth rattle. Before she could recover, he stepped in, crowding her. He forced her backward, step by step, until her spine hit a heavy oak training post. He pinned her there. His massive frame completely trapped her, his wooden blade pressing horizontally against her collarbone. The proximity was instant gasoline. Her breath hitched. The overwhelming scent of dark pine and ozone wrapped around her throat, suffocating her. Zarek leaned in. His chest was flushed against hers. You survive like prey, he whispered harshly. You're distracting me on purpose, she fired back, her heart hammering wildly against his chest. If I wanted to distract you, little wolf. His voice dropped to a dangerous, intimate octave. We wouldn't be holding wooden swords. Vaelia gasped. She pushed hard against his chest. Let me go. Make me. She twisted, bringing her blade up in a desperate, unpredictable arc. Zarek deflected it cleanly. It was a perfect parry. But in the rapid, violent motion of the clash, the splintered tip of his wooden blade grazed the back of her forearm. It was a shallow cut, barely a scratch. Vaelia flinched, dropping her sword. A single drop of blood welled up from her skin. It fell, hitting the dry dirt. It didn't sink in. Hiss. It hissed against the soil, turning the earth pitch black around it. Zarek froze. The air completely left his lungs. The intoxicating scent of dark honey and ash vanished in a fraction of a second. It was replaced by something else. Something ancient. A rotting, metallic stench he hadn't encountered since he was 7 years old. Hiding under a bed while his parents were torn to shreds. The smell of the shadows. The monsters that had slaughtered his bloodline and cursed his heart. The wooden sword slipped from Zarek's grip. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. His fingers twitched once, then went completely still. His heart skipped a violent, painful beat. Vaelia frowned, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up at him. The violent, possessive heat in his golden eyes was completely gone. It was replaced by an absolute, paralyzing terror. Chapter 4. The smoke rose from the dirt. It didn't smell like burning wood. It smelled like rusted iron, rotting leaves, and ancient death. Zarek couldn't breathe. The training yard, the morning sun, the guards, everything faded away. He wasn't the Alpha King anymore. He was a 7-year-old boy again, hiding under a blood-soaked bed. He could hear his mother's final, gurgling scream. He could see the monster's creatures made of living, twisting shadow tearing his father's throat out. And the smell. That exact, suffocating stench. It was radiating from the girl standing right in front of him. Zarek? Vaelia took a cautious step forward, her wooden sword forgotten in the dirt. Your eyes. The golden fire in his gaze had completely shattered. It was replaced by a hollow, rabid madness. He didn't walk toward her. He vanished. Before Vaelia could draw a breath, a massive, bruising hand clamped around her throat. The impact slammed her spine against the heavy oak training post. Her feet left the dirt entirely. She choked, her hands instantly flying up to claw at his wrist. What are you? Who sent you? Zarek's voice was unrecognizable. It wasn't an alpha's growl. It was a broken, demonic rasp. I don't know what you mean. Vaelia gasped, kicking her legs uselessly against the air. He squeezed tighter. The rough bark of the post dug into her back. Stop lying to me. How long have you been hiding? How long have you been waiting to finish the job? Zarek, stop! You're killing her! Garrick shouted from the sidelines. The warden tried to step forward, but the sheer, suffocating aura of killing intent radiating from the king forced him to his knees. The perimeter guards collapsed, gasping for air as the gravity in the yard seemed to triple. Vaelia couldn't breathe. Black spots danced in her vision. She looked down at him, desperately searching for the man who had frozen the fever in her veins just hours ago. He was gone. My parents, Zarek whispered, his face inches from hers. His lips trembled. A single, scalding tear broke free and tracked down his cheek. Your kind butchered my parents. You cursed my blood. And now the fates dare to bind my wolf to a shadow shifter? Vaelia's eyes widened. Shadow shifter. The myth. The extinct monsters from the old tales. She was a human slave. She was an orphan. She shook her head frantically, her nails digging into his skin until she drew blood. I'm not. I swear. Your blood is poison! Zarek roared, the sound echoing off the stone walls of the fortress. It is the shadow rot. You are the enemy. Inside his chest, Zarek's wolf was tearing itself apart. It howled in absolute agony, violently torn between the instinct to protect its chosen mate and the blinding, traumatic need for vengeance. The conflict was destroying him physically. His bones cracked under the pressure of his own restrained power. He looked at her lips. He looked at her pale throat. He wanted to rip it open. He wanted to claim her. I should tear you apart. Zarek ground out, his voice shaking violently. Right here. Right now. I should end your bloodline. Vaelia stopped fighting. Her lungs burned, but she forced her hands to let go of his wrist. She let her arms drop to her sides. She stared into his broken, weeping eyes and completely surrendered to his judgment. If he was going to kill her, she wouldn't beg. Her surrender completely broke him. Zarek gasped, his fingers violently ripping away from her throat as if her skin had turned to white-hot iron. Vaelia crumpled to the dirt. She fell to her hands and knees, coughing violently and clutching her bruised neck. Zarek backed away, his massive chest heaving. His hands trembled so violently he had to curl them into fists. He stared at her as if she were a plague. "But damn it," Zarek whispered, his voice cracking with a devastating hatred for his own weakness. "I would rather destroy myself than let you out of my sight." He turned his back to her. The absolute freezing rejection in that single movement hit Vaelia harder than his physical grip ever could. "Guards!" Zarek commanded, his voice cold and hollow. 4 elite soldiers forced themselves up from the dirt, rushing forward. "Take her to the abyss. Level 9. Strip her of all privileges." Vaelia's head snapped up. Level 9. The absolute dark. The dungeon where prisoners went to be forgotten. "Wait," Vaelia croaked, grabbing a fistful of dirt as she tried to stand. "The tournament. We had a deal, Nissa. The deal is dead," Zarek said coldly, not looking back. "And so are you." Vaelia scrambled to her feet, ignoring the guards closing in. "No! Punish me! Do whatever you want to me, but you promised to protect her. You gave me your word. Zarek, please." He didn't stop. He walked away, walking straight into the shadows of the fortress. The guards grabbed her by the arms. Vaelia fought them, screaming his name, but she was exhausted and completely broken. They dragged her across the yard, her boots carving lines in the dirt. The heavy iron door of cell 904 slammed shut. The lock engaged with a deafening, final clank. Total, suffocating darkness. Vaelia hit the freezing stone floor. She didn't cry. Her throat throbbed where his fingers had bruised her skin, but the pain in her chest was entirely different. It was a hollow, crushing ache. She had been a fool. For a few fleeting hours, when he had held her against the wall, when he had defied Morwenna and stopped the crossbows, she had let her guard down. She had let herself believe the tyrant had a heart. He didn't. He was exactly what everyone said he was. A broken, ruthless beast. She pulled her knees to her chest, shivering violently in the damp cold. Shadow shifter. The realization finally sank in. The black blood. The terrifying void in her eyes during the pit fight. It wasn't a blessing of survival. It was a curse. She was the monster he feared the most. Hours bled into days. Or maybe just minutes. Time didn't exist in the abyss. There was no sound. No air circulation. Just the deafening silence of being completely discarded. Then, the heavy gears of the cell lock ground open. A sliver of pale, flickering torchlight cut through the darkness, blinding her momentarily. Vaelia squinted, pushing herself back against the damp stone wall. Morwenna stepped into the cell. The Regent Luna wasn't wearing her pristine white gown anymore. She wore a dark leather riding habit. In her right hand, she held a thick, heavy silver chain. The metal dragged against the stone floor, making a chilling, metallic scrape. Morwenna smiled. It was a smile of pure, venomous victory. "Did you really think," Morwenna whispered, her voice echoing in the small dead space, "that the king could ever love a monster?" Vaelia didn't answer. She just glared at the woman, her jaw locked tight. Morwenna stepped closer, the torchlight casting long, demonic shadows across her face. "He threw you away, little rat. He left you in the dark to rot." Morwenna crouched down, bringing her face inches from Vaelia's. "He thinks you betrayed him. He thinks your bloodline is his greatest tragedy." Morwenna let out a low, wicked laugh. She reached out, forcefully grabbing Vaelia's chin. "But the truth is, little slave, you are exactly where I need you to be." Chapter 5. The sunlight was a physical assault. After an eternity in the total darkness of the abyss, the midday sun felt like blades slicing into Vaelia's retinas. 2 massive guards dragged her up the rough wooden steps of the execution platform. Her legs couldn't support her weight. The heavy silver chains wrapped around her wrists and throat clanked loudly against the wood, the only sound in the dead-silent courtyard. 3,000 pack members were gathered below. No one cheered. No one spoke. The suffocating tension in the air was unbearable. The guards forced Vaelia to her knees at the center of the platform. She forced her burning eyes to open. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the executioner holding the massive silver broadsword. She looked up at the royal balcony. Zarek sat on the obsidian throne. He didn't look like the terrifying, invincible Alpha King anymore. He looked like a hollow shell. His posture was rigid, his jaw locked. But the golden fire in his eyes was completely dead. He stared straight ahead, looking at the execution block. But his eyes were entirely vacant. He was forcing himself to watch. He was forcing his wolf to witness the death of its chosen mate as a twisted, agonizing penance for his parents' murder. He is already dead inside, Vaelia realized, a fresh wave of heartbreak crashing through her chest. He broke his own soul to follow the law. Citizens of the Obsidian Pack. Morwenna's voice rang out, sharp and triumphant. The Regent Luna stepped to the edge of the balcony, looking down at the crowd. She wore a majestic black gown, playing the role of the righteous protector perfectly. Today, we do not just execute a runaway slave. Today, we eradicate a plague. Morwenna pointed a dramatically gloved finger at Vaelia. The rot of the shadow shifters has infiltrated our walls. But the king's justice is absolute. The darkness ends today. A ripple of nervous murmurs swept through the crowd. Morwenna turned and slowly walked down the stone stairs, stepping onto the wooden execution platform. The guards immediately backed away, bowing their heads. Morwenna stopped inches from Vaelia. She looked down at the bruised, chained girl. A sickeningly sweet, victorious smile stretched across the Luna's face. She raised her hand, signaling the executioner to hold his blade. "Before you die, monster," Morwenna announced loudly for the crowd to hear. Then, Morwenna dropped to one knee. She leaned in so close that the foul scent of her perfume completely masked the smell of the dry wood. "You look absolutely pathetic," Morwenna whispered. Her voice dropping to a venomous, inaudible hiss meant only for Vaelia's ears. Vaelia didn't flinch. "Just give the order. Get it over with." "Oh, I will," Morwenna chuckled softly. "But you see, my dear, I cannot let you die thinking you are the villain of this story. It takes the fun out of it." Vaelia frowned, her breath catching in her throat. "What are you talking about?" Morwenna's eyes gleamed with a twisted, manic delight. Vaelia's eyes darted to the balcony. Zarek hadn't moved a single muscle. His knuckles were bone white as he gripped the arms of the throne. "He spent 20 years hunting ghosts," Morwenna whispered, her words slipping into Vaelia's ear like poison. "He tortured himself. He built this entire tyrannical empire on the belief that the shadows slaughtered his family." Morwenna leaned back slightly, her smile widening into something truly demonic. "But the shadow shifters have been extinct for a century, little rat. They didn't kill his parents." Vaelia's heart skipped a violent beat. Her blood ran ice cold. "No. Yes," Morwenna breathed out, her eyes dancing with wicked triumph. "I hired dark warlocks from the Eastern Covens. It cost a fortune to mimic the shadow magic. I stood in the hallway and listened to his mother scream while my mercenaries tore her throat out." Vaelia stopped breathing. The entire world tilted on its axis. "I ordered them to leave the boy alive," Morwenna continued, completely drunk on her own untouchable arrogance. "A traumatized, cursed child is so much easier to control than a stable king. And it worked beautifully. I ruled through his fear. Until you showed up." Morwenna reached out, her sharp nails digging into Vaelia's cheek. "He didn't just throw away his mate," Morwenna mocked gently. "He is letting the actual murderer stand right beside him while he executes the only light he ever had. Isn't that the most magnificent tragedy you have ever heard?" A ringing sound started in Vaelia's ears. She looked at Morwenna. Then, she looked up at Zarek. He was destroying himself for a lie. The absolute, agonizing weight of Zarek's trauma, the nightmares, the terror, the isolation, it was all manufactured by the woman smiling on this stage. The fear inside Vaelia completely evaporated. The despair vanished. It was replaced by a rage so pure, so ancient, and so utterly violent that it bypassed her human heart entirely. Thump. The executioner gripped his massive sword, raising it high above his head. Executioner! Morwenna stood up, turning to the crowd, her voice echoing with finality. Take her head! The blade swung down. It never hit Vaelia's neck. Clang! The heavy silver broadsword violently ricocheted backward, shattering into 3 jagged pieces. The executioner screamed, falling backward, clutching his violently trembling wrists. Morwenna froze. The crowd gasped. Up on the balcony, Zarek's head snapped up. The temperature in the courtyard didn't just drop, it plummeted to absolute zero. The midday sun was shining, but the light hitting the execution platform suddenly died. What is this? Morwenna stepped back, her voice trembling as the wood beneath her boots began to rot and turn black. Guards, kill her! The heavy silver chains binding Vaelia's wrists began to smoke. Then, they simply dissolved into black ash. Vaelia slowly stood up. She didn't look like a human slave anymore. The shadow of the execution platform detached itself from the ground. It crawled up Vaelia's legs, wrapping around her body like living, breathing armor. Her torn clothes merged with the darkness. When she raised her head, there was no white left in her eyes. It was a terrifying, infinite void of pitch black. The ancient, suffocating aura of a true Shadow Queen slammed into the courtyard, forcing 3,000 wolves to their knees instantly. The sheer pressure cracked the stone walls of the fortress. On the balcony, Zarek's inner wolf didn't cower. It roared. The absolute, paralyzing terror in his chest was suddenly overshadowed by a blinding, magnetic pull toward the darkness on the stage. Vaelia tilted her head. The shadows behind her back violently expanded, erupting into the sky and blocking out the sun entirely. The darkness solidified into dozens of massive, razor-sharp scythes hovering in the air, pointing directly at the Regent Luna. You wanted a monster, Morwenna. Vaelia's voice wasn't human. It was a layered, overlapping echo of 1,000 ancient whispers that shook the very foundations of the earth. Now you have one. Morwenna shrieked in absolute terror. Shoot her! Fire the silver arrows! Kill the beast! Chapter 6. Fire! Morwenna shrieked, pointing her trembling finger at Vaelia. Dozens of heavy bowstrings snapped in unison. A deadly wave of silver-tipped arrows tore through the air, aimed directly at the execution platform. Up on the balcony, Zarek's muscles coiled. He moved to jump, but for a fraction of a second, his body completely paralyzed. He looked down at the stage and didn't see the woman he wanted. He saw the pitch-black, suffocating shadows swirling around her, the exact same darkness that had swallowed his mother's screams 20 years ago. The childhood trauma violently gripped his spine, locking his joints in place. The shadow wrought. The monsters. He hesitated. A lethal, devastating half-second of fear. Then, Vaelia turned her head and looked up at him. Beneath the terrifying demonic void in her eyes, a single tear tracked down her pale cheek. The fear shattered. The king's love violently overrode his trauma. Zarek leaped over the marble railing. Midair, he called upon his wolf. But the psychological block tore the process apart. The shift was violently asymmetrical. His left shoulder dislocated with a sickening pop as human flesh fought the beast. He didn't land as a perfect, majestic predator. He crashed onto the wooden platform as a desperate, half-shifted monster, throwing his heavy, broken body over Vaelia. Because of that half-second hesitation, he was too late to block it all. One silver-tipped arrow slipped past his massive guard, grazing Vaelia's shoulder and tearing a shallow line through her skin. Zarek roared in absolute agony. He planted his trembling paws firmly into the rotting wood, taking the rest of the poisoned arrows directly into his own back to shield her from the volley. Thwack! 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 Cease fire! Morwenna screamed, her voice cracking in absolute horror. Cease fire. The archers froze, lowering their crossbows. The entire courtyard stopped breathing. The great black wolf breathed heavily, his blood pooling on the floorboards. Slowly, the thick fur began to recede. The beast melted back into the man. Zarek collapsed onto his hands and knees. 3 silver arrows protruded deep from his back. The toxic metal hissed against his skin, instantly turning his veins a sickening black. He coughed, spitting blood onto the wood, but he forced his head up. He looked over his bleeding shoulder, locking eyes with Morwenna. "My king," Morwenna stammered, stepping back rapidly. "You are poisoned! The monster, she is manipulating your mind!" Zarek gripped the wooden floorboards. With a wet crack, he reached back and violently ripped an arrow out of his own flesh. He threw the bloody metal at Morwenna's feet. "You whispered your confession to her, Morwenna." Zarek's voice was a lethal, bloody rasp. "But you forgot one thing." Morwenna stopped breathing. "I am the Alpha," Zarek growled, his golden eyes flaring with unhinged fury. "I hear everything." Morwenna panicked. She looked at the stunned guards, frantically waving her hands. "Lies. It is the shadow magic twisting his mind. Kill her." Zarek ignored her. He ignored the guards. He ignored the burning agony of the silver stopping his heart. He turned back to Vaelia, right there, on the blood-soaked execution stage, in front of his entire kingdom. The absolute tyrant of the Obsidian Pack dropped heavily onto both knees. He looked up at the girl he had abused, terrified, and failed. He completely stripped away his pride. "I would rather kneel in her shadows," Zarek declared to the silent crowd, his voice ringing with absolute, unbreakable devotion. "Then sit on your throne." Before Vaelia could speak, Zarek's eyes rolled back. The silver poison finally crashed into his nervous system. He collapsed forward, hitting the floorboards with a heavy thud. Midnight. The king's chambers. The room smelled heavily of burning sage and blood. Zarek lay shirtless on the massive obsidian bed. The arrows were gone, but the silver poison was deeply embedded. His skin burned with a violent fever. Phaedra stepped away from the bed, wiping blood from her hands. "The silver is too deep. His wolf is fighting it, but he won't survive the night." The doctor gave Vaelia a grim look before quietly slipping out of the room. Vaelia sat on the edge of the bed. Her own shoulder throbbed where the stray arrow had grazed her. She reached out, placing her hand against Zarek's violently racing heart. She closed her eyes. She reached into the ancient part of her shadow magic. A soft, black mist leaked from her fingertips, sinking directly into his wounds. But the magic required a vessel. To pull the silver out of him, she had to take it in. Hiss. The toxic silver left his bloodstream and crawled up Vaelia's arm. It burned like liquid fire. Vaelia violently choked. The pain was blinding. Her shadows lashed out involuntarily in pure agony, whipping across the room and shattering the heavy obsidian bedside table into jagged splinters. Her eyes rolled back for a terrifying second before she collapsed heavily against the headboard, gasping for air. A drop of black, silver-laced blood fell from her lips onto her ruined shirt. Zarek gasped, his chest heaving as the fever suddenly broke. His eyes snapped open. He shot up from the mattress, his breath ragged. He didn't pull her into a possessive kiss. He didn't claim her. He looked at Vaelia, slumped and bleeding. Zarek froze. The sheer horror in his eyes was paralyzing. "What did you do?" Zarek whispered, scrambling backward on the massive bed, pressing his own back against the cold stone wall. "I pulled it out," Vaelia rasped, reaching a trembling hand toward him. "You're safe." Zarek looked at her outstretched hand, then at the dark, purple bruises still wrapped around her throat from when he had choked her in the training yard. And now, the glowing silver veins poisoning her because of him. "Don't touch me," Zarek's voice broke. He pulled his knees to his chest, physically recoiling from her. The terrifying Alpha King looked like a broken child. "Zarek." "I hesitated," Zarek shouted, his voice cracking with absolute self-hatred. Tears tracked down his face. "On the stage." I saw your shadows and I froze. I let you get hurt because I was a coward. And now you are poisoning yourself to fix my weakness. It was a fraction of a second, Vaelia pleaded, her heart breaking at the sight of his complete emotional collapse. You still jumped. I am a monster, Zarek wept, violently shaking his head. He gripped his own hair, completely consumed by guilt. Every time I get near you, I break you, I choked you, I threw you in the dark. I can't even save you right. I am killing you, Vaelia. He refused to look at her. The alpha dominance was completely shattered by the devastating realization that his trauma made him toxic to the woman he loved. Crash. The heavy oak doors of the bedroom were violently kicked open. Garrick stumbled into the room, leaning heavily on a shattered sword. The warden's armor was dented. He spat a mouthful of blood and a broken tooth onto the rug. I really hate your stepmother, sire, Garrick wheezed, his face pale with absolute dread. Zarek's breath hitched. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He dragged a trembling hand down his face, smearing his own tears with blood. When he opened his eyes, the broken boy was gone. The ice-cold king returned. Speak. Morwenna escaped the courtyard. She rallied the Eastern Guard. Garrick choked out. He looked directly at Vaelia. She massacred the medical wing. She took the little girl to the cliff of despair. The air in the room turned deathly cold, freezing the blood on the floor. Vaelia slowly stood up from the bed. The glowing silver poison in her veins didn't kill her. It fueled her. She didn't scream. The shadows didn't violently erupt. Instead, they crept out of her skin in dead silence, absorbing every ounce of light in the room. The terrifying, pitch-black void completely swallowed her brown eyes. She wanted a monster, Vaelia whispered. The sound didn't travel through the air. It echoed directly inside Zarek and Garrick's skulls, a chilling, ancient promise of death. She will get one. Chapter 7. The Cliff of Despair wasn't just a name. It was a sheer, jagged drop into a roaring, black ocean. The wind howled like a dying animal, whipping ice and sea salt into the air. At the very edge of the precipice, Morwenna stood, surrounded by 50 elite soldiers of the Eastern Guard. Nissa was tied to a heavy iron ring embedded in the stone, her small body shivering violently in the freezing gale. The heavy steel gates leading to the cliff face suddenly blew inward. They didn't just open. They were violently ripped off their hinges, crashing into the rocks. Zarek stepped through the dust. He didn't wear a crown. He didn't wear armor. He held a massive, double-edged broadsword in one hand, his golden eyes burning with a cold, mechanical lethality. Garrick flanked him on the right, bleeding but gripping twin axes. And on his left, Vaelia walked. The pitch-black shadows bled from her footsteps, staining the frozen earth. I have to admit, Morwenna yelled over the roaring wind, stepping behind Nissa. I didn't expect the king to walk to his own grave for a slave. There is no grave here, Morwenna. Zarek's voice cut cleanly through the gale, carrying absolute authority. Only an execution, Morwenna laughed. A shrill, manic sound. She snapped her fingers. The 50 Eastern Guards drew their weapons. But they didn't charge. Instead, they slammed the hilts of their swords against the rocky ground. Crack! The stone beneath Vaelia's feet violently glowed. A massive, hidden rune circle ignited. A blinding wave of concentrated light and pulverized silver dust erupted from the earth, completely trapping her inside a pillar of searing white heat. Vaelia! Zarek lunged forward, but an invisible barrier of pure light slammed into his chest, throwing his massive frame backward. Inside the pillar, Vaelia screamed. The silver dust ripped through her shadows like acid. The dark, ancient magic inside her violently lashed out, begging to be unleashed. Let us out. The overlapping demonic whispers echoed in her skull. Consume the light. Consume them all. But Vaelia fought it. She squeezed her eyes shut, digging her fingernails into her own palms. If she let the void take over completely, if she gave in to the absolute destruction, she wouldn't be human anymore. She would become the exact monster that haunted Zarek's nightmares. She would forget how to love. Look at her, Morwenna taunted, stepping closer to the edge of the light barrier. She is holding back. She is letting the silver burn her alive because she is terrified of her own skin. "Shut your mouth!" Garrick roared, swinging his axe into the first guard who charged him. The cliff erupted into chaos. Zarek became a blur of lethal precision. He didn't shift into his wolf. He used the broadsword, dismantling the Eastern Guards with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. But there were too many. And the barrier holding Vaelia was fueled by the guard's life force. Vaelia dropped to one knee. The silver burned her lungs. The shadows flickering around her began to recede, dying under the intense, blinding light. She was losing. "Sister," the tiny voice barely pierced the howling wind. Vaelia forced her eyes open. Nissa was frantically gnawing at the thick, rough ropes binding her wrists. The little girl's gums were bleeding. Her teeth were chipped. But she didn't stop. With a desperate, violent jerk, Nissa tore her bruised hands free. "Stop the child," Morwenna snapped. A guard lunged toward Nissa, but before his blade could fall, a heavy broadsword spun through the air, impaling him straight through the chest. Zarek stood 10 feet away, panting heavily, having thrown his only weapon to save the girl. Nissa didn't run away from the battle. She ran straight toward the blinding pillar of light. "Nissa, no!" Vaelia choked out. "The silver will burn you." Nissa didn't listen. She threw her small body directly into the agonizing light. She wrapped her arms tightly around Vaelia's neck, burying her face into her sister's ruined, shadow-drenched shirt. "I don't care," Nissa sobbed, her voice fiercely echoing over the wind. "I don't care if you turn into a demon. I don't care if you're a monster. You are my sister. Rip her apart." Vaelia stopped breathing. The fear holding her back completely snapped. The anchor wasn't her humanity. The anchor was the little girl holding her in the dark. Vaelia slowly wrapped her arms around Nissa. She opened her eyes. The brown irises were gone forever. The infinite, terrifying void returned. But this time, it didn't leak out. It exploded. Boom. The pillar of light violently shattered. The sonic boom threw the remaining Eastern Guards off their feet. The midday sky above the cliff instantly turned pitch black. A solar eclipse materialized out of nowhere. The shadows on the ground didn't just rise. They became physical. Towering spikes of dark matter. Vaelia stood up, holding Nissa behind her. The air pressure dropped so severely that Morwenna's ears began to bleed. "You wanted to see the rot, Luna?" Vaelia whispered. The shadows shot forward. They didn't pierce the guards. They simply swept over them. The 50 elite soldiers dropped their weapons, their eyes rolling back as the darkness consumed their consciousness entirely. They collapsed in a dead faint. Morwenna was left completely alone. The Regent Luna backed up. Her heel slipped on the jagged edge of the cliff. The roaring ocean waited 1,000 feet below. "No!" Morwenna panicked, looking wildly at the towering shadow scythes surrounding her. "Zarek! Zarek! I raised you. I am your queen." Zarek stood a few feet away, covered in enemy blood. He looked at the woman who had manufactured his entire life's trauma. His golden eyes were devoid of any mercy. "You are nothing," Zarek said coldly. Morwenna's face twisted into absolute, venomous spite. If she was going to die, she wouldn't die alone. Her hand darted inside her cloak. She pulled out a short, heavy javelin made entirely of pure, polished silver. It was dripping with nightshade venom. With a feral, desperate scream, Morwenna threw the javelin. She didn't aim at Vaelia. The Shadow Queen would just deflect it. She aimed directly at Nissa. The silver weapon tore through the air with terrifying speed. Vaelia's shadows reacted, but the silver repelled the dark magic, slicing through the defensive mist. It was too fast. Zarek didn't hesitate. He didn't freeze. The childhood trauma that had locked his muscles on the execution stage was completely gone. burned away by the devastating love he held for the woman standing in the dark. He moved faster than humanly possible. He didn't try to block the javelin with his hands. He simply stepped directly into its path. Thunk. The sound was sickeningly loud. The heavy silver javelin breached Zarek's chest, tearing straight through his sternum and burying itself deep into his heart. The howling wind on the cliff seemed to instantly die. Zarek stopped moving. He looked down at the silver shaft protruding from his chest. The toxic black veins immediately spiderwebbed up his neck, far faster and more violent than before. He didn't scream. He slowly turned his head, looking over his shoulder at Vaelia. He gave her a small, broken smile. "Not this time," Zarek whispered, blood spilling past his lips. His knees buckled. The absolute tyrant of the obsidian pack collapsed heavily onto the frozen rocks. "Zarek!" Vaelia's scream tore the sky in half. The darkness completely swallowed the cliff. Chapter 8. The sky didn't tear when Vaelia screamed. It simply died. The midday sun was instantly swallowed by an absolute, cataclysmic void that plunged the cliff of despair into freezing darkness. The roaring ocean below fell dead silent. Morwenna didn't run. The Regent Luna took one look at the shadow rod erupting from Vaelia and realized she couldn't. The shadows slithered across the frozen ground, violently wrapping around Morwenna's ankles and pinning her in place. Vaelia slowly walked toward her. Morwenna gasped, her hands flying to her own chest as an intangible, pitch-black shadow materialized directly inside her ribcage. It wrapped its cold, ancient fingers entirely around Morwenna's beating heart. "You think this is victory?" Morwenna choked out, blood spilling past her lips. The Luna smiled a terrifying, venomous smile. "You just became the exact monster that haunts his nightmares." Vaelia didn't blink. "Kill me," Morwenna wheezed, her eyes wide with manic triumph. "The curse doesn't die with me. The shadow rot is yours now." Vaelia closed her fist. A sickening, wet crack echoed across the cliff. Morwenna's body went completely rigid. Black, oily rot instantly burst from the Luna's pores, bleeding into the frozen dirt like acid. The corruption spiderwebbed outward, permanently turning the surrounding cliffside to dead ash. She collapsed, dead, with that twisted smile still carved into her face. Vaelia didn't spare the corpse a single glance. She dropped to her knees beside Zarek. He didn't move. His golden eyes were dull, staring blankly at the dark sky. The nightshade venom had already turned his veins a decaying black. "My king!" Garrick choked out, falling to his knees beside them, shielding Nissa's eyes. "He's gone." "Vaelia." The silver stopped his heart. Vaelia didn't speak. She reached out and gripped the bloody silver shaft of the javelin. The toxic metal instantly seared her palms, but with a guttural, violent jerk, she ripped the weapon out of his chest and threw it into the dark. She pressed her bleeding hands directly over the gaping wound on his sternum. She didn't pray. She commanded the shadows, "Take my humanity, give him my life." A blinding, ethereal light violently ripped itself from Vaelia's chest, sinking directly into Zarek's wound. It was a brutal, instantaneous extraction of her human soul. Her shadows shrieked in protest, whipping wildly across the cliff as their anchor faded. Thump. Thump. Her human heart beat violently in her ears. Thump. Then, total silence. Vaelia collapsed sideways onto the frozen rocks. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing but the wind howled. Then, Zarek violently gasped. His massive chest heaved. The black, poisoned veins vanished. The gaping wound knitted shut. His golden eyes snapped open, burning brighter than ever before. He shot up. "Vaelia!" Zarek panicked, his hands instantly finding her pale body. He pulled her into his lap, wrapping his massive arms around her. "I'm here. I've got you." But the moment he pulled her against his chest, a violent shudder ripped through his body. She felt like a corpse. Zarek frantically pressed his ear against her chest. "Silence." "No," Zarek whispered, absolute terror crashing over him. He bit his own wrist, tearing his flesh to force his alpha blood past her pale lips. "Take my blood. Wake up." Slowly, Vaelia's eyes fluttered open. There was no brown left in her irises. They were entirely pitch black. "Zarek," she whispered, her voice completely hollow, layered with the terrifying echo of the void. "I'm here," he promised, pressing his burning, feverish forehead against hers. "You're safe." Vaelia slowly raised her freezing hand. She touched his cheek. "Why are you so cold?" she asked. Zarek froze. His skin was burning with alpha heat. He was radiating warmth. "I'm not cold, little wolf," he said, his voice shaking. "Yes, you are," Vaelia whispered, a single, black tear falling from her void-like eyes. She pressed her hand flat against his chest, right over his violently beating heart. "I can't feel it, Zarek. I know you're holding me, but I can't feel your heat. I can't feel anything at all." The horror dawned on Zarek. The shadows had permanently severed her from the physical warmth of the living world. She was trapped in a sensory prison of eternal ice. Morwenna's final curse had come true. 1 month later. The Obsidian Palace. The midday sun beat down brightly on the kingdom, but inside the great throne room, it was entirely dark. Heavy, impenetrable black velvet drapes covered every massive window. The heavy oak doors opened. Garrick stepped in, wearing the gleaming armor of the royal general. "My king." Garrick bowed deeply, looking at the floor. "The outer camps are dismantled. Princess Nissa is safe in the royal wing." "Dismissed, General." Zarek's low, rumbling voice echoed from the shadows. Garrick bowed once more and quickly closed the heavy doors. Zarek sat on the massive obsidian throne. He looked down at the woman draped across his lap. Vaelia rested her head against his chest. Her skin was as pale as moonlight. She stared blankly at the empty room with her terrifying, pitch-black eyes. Zarek reached up, his massive, warm hand gently stroking her hair. He knew she couldn't feel the warmth of his touch. He knew his embrace felt like nothing more than cold pressure against her skin. "The council will complain," Vaelia murmured softly, her hollow voice breaking the silence. "A king cannot rule his kingdom entirely from the shadows." "You need the sun, Zarek." Zarek stopped her hand. He brought her freezing fingers to his lips, pressing a deep, worshipping kiss to her knuckles. Even knowing it brought her no physical comfort, his glowing golden eyes locked onto her terrifying, beautiful black ones. There was no hesitation. Only a possessive, eternal obsession that bordered on absolute madness. He pulled her tightly against his chest, refusing to ever let go. "If you cannot feel the sun," Zarek whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal, terrifying finality, "then I will tear it out of the sky. Let the world freeze with us.